Yeah, hi folks. Yes, our totalitarian thug is finally resigning. And that document exposed by Sean Plunkett the other day called Tiriti Framework for News Media is very much part of her legacy. Yes, as we all know, that control freak Ardern is now controlling the media, and this taxpayer-funded framework is part of it. In short, unless media outlets agree to support radical Maori interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi, they will not be eligible for government funding. Now, as I'm mainly going to focus on the wokesters who wrote this document, I'll start Sean off at about 7.5 minutes in.
It is an official government document, not some mushroom that sprouted up under a tree somewhere. So that is why we are not going to get any response as yet from New Zealand on air. And I'm taking you through this, I hope, slowly. I hope you can follow. I hope you've got time to follow. So what is Tiriti? The treaty framework for news media, and this $100 million worth of funding that New Zealand on air has published. Well, let's just go to the introduction. This document presents a Tiriti framework for news media as a starting point for news producers to develop their own Tiriti strategies in ways that suit their context. While this framework is grounded in Treaty of Waitangi and mass media obligations to Maori, I wasn't aware that I had obligations to Maori during my time in the mass media. I always thought I had obligations to the truth. That's the primary obligation that the news media has. As I said, obligations to Maori is tangata whenua, people of the land. It may be relevant for other groups who face racism in our society. So suddenly, obligations turn into an obligation regarding racism. So the very introduction to this missive is that New Zealand is racist. Nice start. Nice start. The framework is an overview with action areas and some critical questions that should be useful for the development of media strategies and practices, which to my mind, it goes on a little bit more, but to my mind, fundamentally, it says this is a document that is going to tell journalists how to suck eggs. And if you don't suck eggs our way, you don't get any money from the taxpayer, and we know you're strapped for cash. Also, by the way, as you listen to this, think about the things that outrage you on television, on TV3 and TVNZ and Stuff and Spin-Off. Think about the things that drive you nuts, and you're going to find, as I talked to you this morning, the genesis for the things that are driving you crazy about the news media in New Zealand. It's not an independent document. It is the thought police protocols for the brave new world of news media in New Zealand. Let's look at this as a news media framework through. We go on to page 5. Rationale. Oh, I'm looking forward to this. Now, as tangata whenua, says the document, of Aotearoa, or New Zealand as we're more commonly known, Maori, get this, and this is, don't forget, this is the starting point. This is the first gutsy piece of this document. Maori have never ceded sovereignty to Britain or any other state. The Declaration of Independence and the Treaty of Waitangi asserted and continue to assert Maori sovereignty and was signed by Hapu and the Crown. The treaty carries rights and obligations for both parties with implications for social justice. Despite the treaty, colonial constitutional practices have entrenched Pakeha systems of governance that continue today. This means our society has a foundation of institutional racism, where organisations, agencies and institutions continue to benefit Pakeha and routinely produce policies and practices that result in avoidable inequalities between Pakeha and Maori. So the very basis of this document, folks, the very basis is that New Zealand is a racist country and that Maori are not like the rest of us. They are an independent nation.
Are you hearing this, folks?
So to get any money from New Zealand On Air and the taxpayer as a journalist and a media organisation, you have to accept that we live in a country which we are the occupiers in. If you're non-Māori, all non-Māori, that's what I presume they mean by Pākehā, are colonial oppressors. We are racist, our institutions are racist, and Māori have a right to their own form of governance and government that is separate from being part of the Westminster-style democracy we call New Zealand, run by a parliament through elections every 3 years. That is the starting point of the philosophy that news organisations must accept and implement to get more than $100 million or be able to get any slice of the more than $100 million in government funding available to news organisations. I want to ask you the question, and I'd love you to text in. Is that a view of New Zealand that you agree with?
No.
That we are separate peoples living in a racist post-colonial society, that Maori, however you choose to define them, have not ceded sovereignty, do not need to recognise the parliament that we have or the way our system of law and governance works, because that is fundamentally the basic rationale of this entire document. And I wonder how many New Zealanders would agree with that. And I stress again, this is not an independent think piece by some wokesters at Massey University.
Yeah, so let's have a look at these wokesters who are pushing this garbage out.
Nau mai, haere mai, ki tēnei kauhauranga hera hera.
Now, this is Jenny Rankin, a radical Australian feminist who now identifies as Pākehā.
Tēnā rā koutou ki ngā mana whenua o Tāmaki Makaurau, kia koutou o ngā haue whā, ngā tangata tiriti, ngā manuhiri I tāwahi hoki. Tēnei te mihi. Ngā mihi nui ki o tātou kaituao, no rawa ko Carol. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to this important webinar. Ko tangata tiriti ahau, ko Jenny Rankin, taku ingoa, and I'm your chair. We acknowledge all those on whose land we're standing today.
And this is some of her fine work. 10 Decolonization skills for non-Maori Kiwis. Understand the Declaration of Independence and Tiriti o Waitangi. Support an equitable treaty settlement process. Pronounce Maori names correctly. Recognise Pākehā culture. And on she goes. And here's some more of her fine work. Racism stops with me, white men. Now, this is white apologist Dr. Moewaka Barnes, who depicts Maori as victims in TV dramas, etc.
I want to focus on Māori audience responses here. And just overall, what was found was that Māori are doing a lot of work when they're watching representations of themselves on the screen. Māori have been traumatised. They don't want to be further traumatised by what they watch or how they respond, which at times they found very disconcerting. And as an audience, Māori were deeply affected and worked hard to preempt and address what they saw or what they were expecting to see. And against the backdrop of colonisation and negative stereotypes that pervade Māori representations, Māori participants undertook multiple forms of meaning-making and negotiated complex responses. And I can't emphasise how active Māori were, intellectually, imaginatively and emotionally. So many of the Māori participants, even before they were watching the drama, and we discussed what it was prior to them watching it, they were holding their breath. They were waiting for the worst. They were expecting to see the worst. Shortland Street is an example. So Shortland Street is a soap opera that's been running since the 1990s. It's quite a fairly popular show. It's in a hospital setting and it follows the lives of staff and their family and friends. There's a young Māori male character from a low-income family in the episode, and he displayed the expected characteristics. He was a drug dealer, he was dishonest, he was overall trouble. A young Māori woman participant created a very detailed narrative that worked against this depiction. She explained it, and she explained that his motivation to sell drugs wasn't coming from a place of being a bad person, but it was to provide for his family and his sick sister, and that was the only option he had to get money. And she asked, why was this young man put in this situation? Because the white privileged characters knew about the family's struggles, but they did nothing to help financially. Instead, they vilified him for his actions, and the audience was intended to see him as a bad egg.
Yeah, so selling drugs must now be depicted as good. Now, this is privilege-seeking Belinda Borrell.
Kia ora, one of those people on the desktop. And I'm aware that I didn't actually say my name when I introduced myself, so my apologies. I'm Karen Nee and I'm based here at Otago. So, but really interesting, Belinda, in terms of what you're talking about. And I found it really powerful.
Really powerful.
Your kind of analogy with patriarchy that has, implications for men, disproportionate implications for women. And I wondered if, and I suppose I was also connecting, the harm of privilege with your comment about white fragility. And I just wondered if you can talk more about both those ideas, which I think are really interesting.
Yeah. So white fragility is this, people are generally uncomfortable talking about racism when it's discrimination, but when it's privilege, it seems to take it to a whole nother realm of discomfort, because it's almost like it goes against human nature. No one wants to think that there are things that they do that other people can't do, that there are things that they are allowed to do. There are things that, there's ways that they get treated that other people can't get, because that really cuts to the heart of, those ideas of fairness and equality that are really so important, and particularly in Pākehā identity, that we are all the level playing field, that thing, this, and particularly this idea of fairness. And I think that, Pākehā distort that idea, the fairness is manifest, with all the kind of ignorance, so not having Māori wards is fair.
Because it is fair. Maori can get on councils just like everyone else, but no, you want privilege. Now this is Tim McCreena.
So obviously the treaty is a major theme in Pākehā talk. Interestingly, it is cast as the treaty rather than Tiriti, and it is translated or focused on, at best, a set of rather general treaty principles, which mean that Te Tiriti is kind of sidelined, and the detail and substance of the promises held by that covenant are actually minimised and diluted. So the treaty is definitely a theme. One of the themes that you will have come across in this webinar series, particularly through Belinda Borrell's work, is the one that says Māori have undue and unfair privileges in society. So these are things like educational scholarships, sports teams, housing loans, fishing quota.
Yeah, now this is Raymond Nen, the last contributor.
etc. Yeah. Right?
Parliamentary seats.
Yeah, parliamentary
Maori
seats.
electoral.
Those things are spoken of and constructed as privileges that Māori have, and in their effect is the effect of that theme, the privilege theme, is to construct Māori as unfairly or unduly obtaining advantages in society that are not available to other people.
So now you want the media to lie about that truth.
Another very familiar one will be what we refer to as the good Māori, bad Māori theme. So Māori who fit in and contribute and add to the colonial society that we live in are constructed as good Māori, and
because they are.
Those who resist or protest or in various ways object to the way in which colonisation has been rolled out and maintained in this country are constructed as bad Māori.
Again, because they are. Now, these 5 nutters I've just shown you are now controlling the media.
This has been paid for by you, it has been commissioned by a government agency, and it has been published by a government agency in the context of criteria for allocating government money. It also says news media organisations have an obligation to be accountable and responsible in the way they represent Maori and decide what is newsworthy, as well as how they organise their own structures and processes to align with the Treaty of Waitangi. Or one might say, this document's incredibly radical and separatist interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi. I can't remember Article 77.A, which says news media and radio being written in the treaty. So one can presume this has all been made up post the actual signing of the treaty. But this believes, and the government therefore believes, that there is an obligation on the news media to give Māori some special status in regards to this. The document then goes through a whole lot of action plans and questions that media organisations who want to get their hands on taxpayer funds, they've got to ask questions about how they recognise the treaty. Who's leading the work in their organisation to recognise the treaty? How does the organisation take responsibility for its culture and environment? How do news practices need to change to reflect the treaty? How does the organisation embed autonomy for Māori news into its work? What's the difference, for goodness sake, between Māori news and normal news? The truth, some facts, presented in context. That's the way journalism works. How do you assess what stories are newsworthy in light of the treaty? Well, stories your audience are going to be interested in, no matter the colour of their skin or their ethnic background. What are the values, we should ask ourselves, that result in inequitable reporting of Māori and Māori issues? Well, that's presuming you think the reporting is inequitable. Also in action areas, staff recruitment and training support. I do not, by the way, the platform would appear not to meet any of these criteria, and I'm damn proud of it. How does journalism training need to change to teach and reflect on the treaty-based journalism practices? Who says it does? How do media organisations recruit, train and support and actively promote Māori journalists? I'll promote journalists, good journalists, no matter what the colour of their skin is. How do they get them into management and decision-making positions? Well, they're good at their jobs. It's called a meritocracy, New Zealand On Air. They are good at what they do. They are fair, balanced, impartial. They're not a-holes. But oh no, they've got to be the right ethnicity as well. How are non-Maori staff trained so they can cover Maori stories? This includes the Treaty of Waitangi history and interpretation, Te Reo pronunciation, tikanga, and understanding colonial history. What about understanding all history? Now, okay, you get the idea, and I'll explain why this has dominated my life for the last few nights. There's a section in this called Societal Accountabilities. You're not going to believe what you hear next. And once again, don't forget, official government document paid for by you, published by New Zealand On Air, criteria for getting money from the taxpayer. As a result of colonisation, we live in a society that perpetuates racism and inequities. In response, many Maori organisations and networks are decolonising, and Pākehā-led non-government organisations are restructuring themselves according to Te Treaty o Waitangi. For news media, it is not simply a matter of reporting fairly, but of constructively contributing to the treaty relations and social justice. Boy, are they telling us how to suck eggs at an enormous rate of knots. So the government is arguing through this document that we're in a process of decolonisation, and the news media must be actively involved in that process. Shouldn't it? Should be actively involved in telling the truth and reflecting changes in our society. It goes on. Media organisations need to consider the colonial context of living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and identify structural causes, institutional racism, colonisation, inequities, and Pākehā advantage that influence their reporting and the issues they report. So you have to recognise white privilege. White privilege must be part of the culture of your news organisation to get any money from the Public Interest Journalism Fund or from New Zealand On Air. So one presumes when Paddy Gower makes his partially state-funded documentaries, he recognises post-colonial white privilege. There is a reference to male privilege and 50-year-old males later on in the document. So it is full of its own prejudice and bile. This domain focuses on how news media construct and present issues, particularly whether broader accountabilities and systems are considered and how Maori are represented. 2 pages of detailed examples of alternative practices are provided in the evidence section. So how to be woke. It is literally an instruction book on how to be woke. And remember, if you're not woke, if you don't pay lip service to wokedom and adopt these recommendations, you are ineligible for more than $100 million, or your share, your slice of more than $100 million in free government money. Look, they go on to talk about worldviews and norms. You have to ask yourself, how does the organisation address the issue of use of language and culture in news items? This could mean increasing everyday use of Te Reo Māori in news items.
Yeah, and forcing people to learn Te Reo in the process.
And including information about tikanga as context in news stories. So many people I read say, I don't understand the weather anymore. Are we speaking English or are we speaking Māori? Well, we're speaking both. And this is the official guide, suggestion guide. This is where it comes from. It's telling news media to get the money, you got to throw in some Māori words and be woke. There we go. It's right there. Well, actually in red and white. It's published, not black and white. How does the organisation question and broaden its interpretation of news values by considering Māori-controlled news media interpretations without putting an excess burden on Māori staff? Now, that's the other thing. You want to have a Māori perspective. Don't work the Māori staff too hard in giving a Māori perspective. All the while, throughout this document, it delineates between someone who is a Māori reporter and a Pākehā. And they use Pākehā, it seems to me, in this document in the context of white, if not subliminally white male. It is a document that speaks very little about Pacific Islanders, other immigrants from other places, other cultures, other ethnicities, doesn't talk about Indian people particularly, Asian people particularly. It has a very binary, bicultural view of the world. And it's also got some instructions, though I've got to be fair. It also tells Maori media organisations how to suck eggs. I could go on and on and on. I've spent hours poring over this. And it is so disappointing. It is so disappointing that New Zealand On Air won't front to talk to this official document that has lied saying it's an independent report. No, it's an independent report you commissioned, paid for and published. It's policy. It's New Zealand On Air policy. And here are the hoops laid out before us, the hoops that our news media are jumping through to scrabble for the crumbs of government funding that are handed out to them. And how willing they are to accept Willie Jackson's view of a completely separate New Zealand world where there are going to be two governments and two nations in the one landmass.
Yeah, but of course the white nation will have to pay for the Maori nation. Now, this is the full document that Sean was referring to, and I've posted a link to it below, along with other links as well. Anyway, folks, I'll stop it there.